Hello everyone, and welcome to this brand new two-part video series, Forced into Divorce. Every 13 seconds, someone in America gets divorced, and it is something that children are roped into without a choice. Unfortunately, something that was traditionally seen as taboo has now become commonplace in our society today. Now, the purpose of these videos is to look into the psychological effects of divorce on children in varying stages of life. The kids are often the ones who experience the most significant loss, and they must learn to grow up in an environment where divorce is constructive and not destructive. Through in-depth research and analysis, I hope to shed light on something that I don't think gets talked about enough today. The negative effects that divorce has on children and the events that surround it are extremely harmful for a child's maturity and growth, and each stage of life has its own different effects. Today I'm going to be sharing my experience living in a divorced family. It is something that has affected my life on multiple levels, and it still does to this day. I will be looking at various studies and professional analyses to see how my experiences align with that of these studies so that we can learn how to create a safe, secure, and stable environment for those who may be struggling. And if you are someone who is struggling with adverse effects of divorce or is struggling to find ways to cope with your parents' separation, I hope that this can be therapeutic for you. Every family, every child experiences divorce differently, and I understand that divorce is sometimes necessary for the betterment of the child and the family dynamic. These are just my experiences. My name is Mike Bachman. I'm 22 years old, and I was forced into divorce when I was 6 years old. Before I get into my personal experiences, I just want to give a brief background on the history of divorce in our country. Traditional laws in the United States made it virtually impossible to obtain a divorce because those laws looked at a divorce from a fault-based perspective. Traditional fault grounds for divorce were cruelty, adultery, desertion for a specified period of time, imprisonment, and the physical inability to engage in intercourse. Most of this revolves around a rule known as the clean hands doctrine, which said that the complaining party could not have contributed to the problem. And because divorce falls under the jurisdiction of state governments, each state had their own laws on how they carried these things out. However, in 1970, California Governor Ronald Reagan signed the first no-fault divorce law into effect. Now, filing for a divorce no longer required a showing of wrongdoing by either party. And by 2010, every state in the United States passed a no-fault divorce law, with New York being the last to do so. And of the 50 states, 17 of them are what we call true no-fault states, where couples can only file on no-fault grounds. Filing for a divorce was now as accessible as ever, and Reagan had acknowledged to his son Michael that signing the no-fault divorce law in California was his greatest regret in public life. And there's much controversy that surrounds divorce law in the United States, but I'm not going to get into any more of those specifics. Regardless, people's views on divorce have changed drastically over time. A survey published by the Statista Research Department shows the moral stance of Americans regarding a divorce in the year 2018. 76% of participants said that getting a divorce is morally acceptable, whereas 20% of participants said that getting a divorce is morally wrong. 3% of participants believed that it depends on the situation, and 1% had no opinion. And these numbers are staggering. I want to now talk through my experiences growing up in a divorced family in comparison to my research. So let me give you some brief context about my family. I grew up in a small family of 4. It was my mother, my father, myself, and my brother, who is 4 years older than I. Early memories of my childhood pre-divorce are fuzzy, not gonna lie. Like any other 6-year-old though, I spent a lot of time playing with friends, playing games, playing sports, and just being a kid. And then one afternoon, my life changed forever. My parents sat my brother and I down in our living room. As a 6-year-old, I really didn't have a clue as to what was going on. There were a few instances where I would catch my mom crying on the phone or being sad when my dad was traveling for work. And naturally, that made me sad, just seeing my mom upset. But I was too young to really put 2 and 2 together. Being that my brother is 4 years older than me, which would have made him around 10 years old or roughly so at the time, I think he was able to understand what was going on much more than I did. I just remember my parents sitting us down. My mom was in tears already, went on to tell us that dad isn't going to be living with us anymore. My brother and I started crying, then my dad starts crying, and this was the first time and one of the only times that I've really seen my dad cry. And honestly, my memory after that is pretty blank, just overwhelmed with emotion and uncertainty as to what was going on or what was going to happen next. The only other thing that I remember that day was the moment when my dad left, and it was awful. It was absolutely awful. The first study that I want to look at discusses the impact of family structure on the health of children and its effect on divorce. Two meta-analyses were conducted 10 years apart from each other that compared children living in divorced single-parent families with children living in continuously intact families on measures of well-being. The research was published by the Linaker Quarterly, which is the oldest continuously published bioethics journal in the United States. The research highlights that a child will lose time with each parent. When my dad left, my brother and I would visit him every other weekend and an occasional dinner during the week. Beyond that, my dad was at every sporting event, musical performance, you name it. My mom was there as well in the same way, but as a kid with everything going on, it was really great to see my dad at these events when he was no longer living with us. But I wouldn't necessarily say that I lost much time with my mother. I can understand why some children may lose time because mothers may have to work longer hours to support the family as a result of the divorce. The research highlights that a child will lose both economic and emotional security. Like I mentioned before, parents may experience financial instability depending on their situation, and this can have adverse effects on a child. Emotional security is related to weakened relationships with parents, the loss of family traditions, and any changes in residence. I was fortunate enough to grow up next door to my grandparents on my dad's side. I remember every Christmas they would walk down after we opened presents and spend the morning with us. After my parents got divorced, that tradition stopped. And this is something that may cause a child to never have a full recovery because events like holidays, birthdays, or any event worth celebrating reminds the child of his or her loss. When my dad first left, visits were strange because we were bouncing around a lot. I remember staying at some local hotels before he settled in his condo about 45 minutes away from my mother's house. The changes in residence didn't necessarily have an effect on me emotionally because I was happy that I was seeing my dad. It was definitely something that took a little while to adapt to. The research highlights that a child may have decreased social and psychological maturation as anxiety tends to worsen after a divorce. Divorce is something that children don't have any input on, so naturally, I was feeling sad, I was anxious, I didn't want to go to school, I really didn't want to be seen by anybody. And when you're in grade school, it's very difficult to express your feelings over something this substantial. You're afraid that if you say something wrong, it will make matters worse than they already are, or you have this notion that you're the reason for the divorce in the first place. Because the world revolves around the children to begin with, in a sense, children feel obligated to stitch those wounds, and if children are unsuccessful, we hold on to those as much as we possibly can before facing the reality that life will never be the same, and things were not getting better from an emotional standpoint for me, and unfortunately this started to eat away at my performance in school. It was harder to be social with my friends because I would more than likely keep to myself. I almost felt like a target in a sense because I wasn't sure if my friends knew what was going on, and because I kept to myself for a while, I wasn't really interacting with much of my friends anymore. Family structure goes beyond the first few years that transpired after the divorce. Life was all right as I began to get older. I had a very healthy relationship with both of my parents and their new significant others. My mom's boyfriend was awesome in the sense of being a great friend. He would bring over waffles, we would play games, and he would make up for lost time in a sense. My brother is my best friend, but when we were younger, we fought like every other set of brothers, so my mom's boyfriend was a great friend for that time being. I experienced a dramatic shift in my life when my mother got engaged to my now stepdad, who was the boyfriend at the time. I was a sophomore in high school at this point, and once again, my life was about to change forever, and I'm gonna be honest. When she told me, I was conflicted. Being her son, nothing makes me happier than seeing my mother happy, and being with my stepdad was that, and I've never seen her happier, and it made me so happy that he was giving her that joy. At the same time, I felt like my life was being overtaken by this new reality. I was holding on to the past for 10 years, and now I was forced to accept the fact that I am going to have two families. Several studies published by the American Sociological Review show that adolescents face more problems in stepfather families than in mother-only families. Being that I was now in high school and my brother was off to college at this point, it was just me and my mom for a while. Now I was getting 4 step siblings and a massive extended family from my stepdad's side with whom I was not very close with to begin with. Honestly, I felt isolated whenever we would visit my stepdad's relatives for celebrations. Everybody was much older than I, and I just had a hard time fitting in. But as I grew older, as I grew more mature, I really valued that time and became much more involved with them. Finally, the house that I grew up in was getting a huge addition. Plus, it was my stepdad's construction company that was putting the addition on the house. And I carried a lot of sentimental value from the place that I grew up in, and watching it get torn apart was a little difficult. Yes, in return, we were getting this big, beautiful new house, but again, this was the moment where I really couldn't hold on to the past anymore, and I couldn't come to terms with that. Everything was happening so quickly, and I began to develop an anger and aggression because of that. I am admitting that some of my anger was unnecessary, but at the same time, I felt like I was caught in the middle of everything that was happening. Every couple of months or so, I would get into involuntary arguments with my mother. More times than not, these would turn into shouting matches. She would come at me and say that my behavior has changed towards my stepdad and her, and I would try to refute it, obviously. Because of this change in my behavior, my mom started to think that I didn't like her anymore, or that I was being manipulated in some way by some outside source. And this only added to my anger because I wasn't conveying my feelings in a proper way, and neither was my mother, and it was just an unhealthy back and forth banter that made matters worse. This, along with most of my experience growing up in a divorced family, can be attributed to one factor: communication. More often than not, children are used to bridge the gap of communication from one parent to the next. Tamara Afifi is a professor of communications at USCB, and her research focuses on how family members cope communicatively with various challenges. I hated becoming a messenger of information. It only added to the unnecessary burden that I was carrying my whole childhood. Why was I responsible for relaying information from one parent to the next? There were even times where if one parent said something nasty to the other, I would most likely hear about it. It felt like it became a problem that I caused. And that is not a healthy way to raise your child in a divorced family. Dr. Gary Newman is a licensed family counselor that appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show and has appeared on Oprah Show for a while, talking to 2 siblings about their painful feelings about their parents' divorce. And one of the biggest complaints that Dr. Newman gets from kids is one parent criticizing the other. No matter what the situation is, it is important that the children are not engaged in this behavior. Dr. Newman also raised a powerful point about how we heal. We heal through love and connection, and many parents may just say to their kids, "Just come and talk to me." In reality, that can be very intense for a child. The way that children cope with their parents' divorce says a lot about how resilient and brave they are. I will be discussing the various coping mechanisms that kids may use when dealing with their parents' divorce in my next video, so please subscribe to this channel if you would like to learn more about that. Despite everything that has happened in my life, I could not be more grateful for where I am today and how these events have shaped me. Yes, it became very difficult at times, but I have an amazing support system behind me. Both of my parents have sacrificed so much over the past 10-15 years for the betterment of myself and my brother, and they're amazing, loving parents, and I hope that they realize that, because divorce in plain English sucks for everybody. I may not have agreed with some of the actions that took place, but I know that my parents are well-intentioned and do it out of love, and I wouldn't trade anything about these past 15 years. I love my mom and my dad. I have great appreciation for both of my step-parents because they make my parents happy, and that's all that matters to me. I will leave you here with a story. While conducting my research, I came across a story from the man by the name of Herv G. Weary. I will link his presentation in the description box below if you care to check it out, but the story was how strong co-parenting through a divorce had positive effects on his daughter. One way that he did this was by writing a book to their daughter outlining the love story he and his ex-wife had. It was important for their daughter to understand that just because they may not be a loving couple anymore doesn't mean that they aren't loving parents. And I thought this was so beautiful, and I hope that whoever is watching this up to this point is able to listen and learn from these experiences and from this research, No child deserves to be forced into divorce, but we must continue to make these events constructive and not destructive for the well-being of the children. I want to thank everybody for watching. Please be sure to give this video a big thumbs up and leave a comment below, please. I hope that you were able to learn something new, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care, everybody.